Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of BSN's Diversity League Table Study 2020. I'm Paulette Maston, Chair of the Black Solicitors Network and editor of this publication. Before we begin, I should mention a couple of housekeeping points. This session is being recorded, so I hope that's okay with everyone. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists after the panel discussion. Please use the Q&A online function during the webinar and state who your question is for so that we can direct it. And of course, we will try to answer as many questions as we can. Thank you very much. So it is poignant that we are launching this publication a year to the day that George Floyd was murdered at the hands of those who were meant to protect and to serve. The ensuing outpouring across the world last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and global race protests really laid bare the pervasive racial disparities, injustices, and inequalities that exist in our society, and dare I say it, in our profession as well. That this horrific event happened in the midst of a global pandemic with a severe and disproportionate impact on ethnic minority communities just serves to heighten these inequalities. These historic, tumultuous events forced organizations and society at large to have conversations on race that for years, decades even, we've either avoided or skirted around. People talk of courageous conversations on race, and I'm sure you'll all admit there was a lot of talk on race, and there still is, and a noticeable shift in people's perspective. In June 2020, BSN published an open letter to the profession calling on firms and other organizations to walk the talk, to turn positive intentions into positive action and create a level playing field for all. The overwhelming response from law firms stepping up to the plate and confronting these issues really demonstrates their desire to move the dial on race and a realization that there is still a lot of work to be done. Interestingly enough, research for DLT 2020, the Diversity League Tables 2020, which is our current edition, began back in February 2020, before the pandemic and the global race protests. I would say that if the case studies featured in this publication are intended to represent a microcosm of the efforts and strides being made by firms to address issues of racial equity and inclusion, then I believe we can be hopeful. So just by way of background, BSN's Diversity League Table, sponsored by the Law Society, was first published in 2006, and it's an annual survey of participating law firms and chambers across core diversity strands of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disabilities. Over the years, the DLT became widely considered as the profession's leading diversity reporting initiative. After 10 successful years of the DLT, we stepped back a bit and reevaluated the publication as a diversity survey and measure, and undertook a review and analysis together with BSN's lead researcher, Professor Peter Irwin, of the data sets collected from firms over the preceding 10 years of DLT. An overarching theme arising from this retrospective was there had been little discernible change in gender and ethnic diversity at the middle to senior levels of the profession. And this was despite the development of a wide body of experience, knowledge, and initiatives in the area of diversity and inclusion. And this really prompted us to look beyond the annual reporting of diversity issues, the problem, if you will, via the sort of traditional DLT and other surveys, towards identifying and exploring where change is happening within the profession, whether there is tangible commitment beyond box-ticking policies and practices, and what disruptive measures actually work to shift the dial. The result is DLT 2020, which features 7 case studies from leading global law firms, Allen & Overy, Brian Cave Leighton Paisner, Freshfields Brockhouse Derringer, Herbert Smith Freehills, Latham and Watkins, Linklaters, and Norton Rose Fulbright. These case studies focus predominantly on issues of race and ethnicity. With that, I would like to thank these 7 law firms for allowing BSN and our research team led by Professor Peter Irwin to interview those involved in their D&I case study interventions, including key stakeholders and beneficiaries of these programs, and to conduct the research that has culminated in this publication. I will now hand over to Professor Irwin to provide a preview of the publication's findings. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Paulette. If somebody can share the slides, that would be great. Whilst we're waiting for that, can I just say a thanks to the Westminster research team, so Cecily, Fatima, Sylvia and Elizabeth, who carried out with myself about 21 interviews, so 3 in each firm. So the idea, just to give you an idea of where the information comes from, there was an interview with the person or people who were designing the intervention or who had kind of responsibility for delivery, then somebody who was a line manager or a mentor who was kind of delivering to individuals, and then in each firm somebody who was a recipient of the intervention or a member of the affinity group, or basically a target for support. So I'm going to present my take on the findings. Please do have a look at the case studies and the conclusion and the various other parts of the publication, because there's a lot more there. So this is just my take. And also the things that I kind of took from this, you know, very much influenced by the interviews that I carried out as well. They were very compelling, and lots of people, you know, as Paulette said, if we kind of took this as a microcosm of what's happening in the sector, then there is some reason to have at least some kind of more positive thoughts about this. But let's see if we can get this happening across the sector more generally. So ultimately, Paulette's kind of talked to you about the new case study approach, which shares insights into specific interventions. I've kind of grouped them into 3 kind of types, just to give you an idea of the things that we're talking about. So the Reach and Smart Start schemes in Allen and Overy, the Linklaters Inspire Development Programme, and Norton Rose Fulbright's programme for high potential lawyers. These are all programs that are primarily, they've got other kind of aims as well, but they're primarily aimed at supporting those to progress up the profession. So people who've become individuals from BAME backgrounds who've already become lawyers, and trying to make that change at the top, because we're seeing increasing diversity at the bottom of the profession and coming into the profession in terms of ethnicity and gender, but it's just not translating to change at the top. So, you know, I've grouped those. Similarly, you know, obviously the Black Lawyers Group has a much broader range of activities. It's got what I would call a kind of employee voice focus as well, trying to communicate to those in charge at the top issues and problems that are apparent in the company, but also they're there to support individuals to get to the top of the profession as well. So I think it's useful to think of those case studies in that context. And then widening access to the profession, trying to get new lawyers from non-traditional backgrounds into the profession. So the Race for Change programme at Brian Cave Leighton Paisner, and the Stephen Lawrence scheme at Freshfields Brockhouse Derringer. So these, if we can go to the next slide, please. So I think that it's useful to consider those as, there we go. So as I said, that's the primary aim of those particular activities and those interventions. All the schemes have, and all the case studies talk about changing organisational culture, and I'm going to come back to this. So they all have aims to change the organisational culture, because these things, they don't flow one way. It's not the participants obviously get lots of support and so on, but also those who are engaged in providing support also have learning as well. And in that respect, understanding the diverse perspectives reverse mentoring scheme at HSF, it is more specifically targeted at that changing culture. So I was, I carried out a few of these interviews, and I was particularly impressed with the way that impacts the reverse mentee, i.e. the more senior member of the firm who was paired with somebody who was more junior and so on. And what really came out of all of these case studies was obviously there is a focus on supporting lawyers and new entrants to the profession from BAME backgrounds, with a particular focus on black people from black backgrounds and really getting black lawyers to the top, because we have got in that BAME, there's been a lot of talk about the BAME category, and there's a lot of variety in the achievement of different groups in that wider BAME group, but definitely there is a focus on trying to increase the number of black lawyers, particularly in senior positions. But there's also a focus on social background, so particularly the widening access programs, and an interesting generational perspective in that with all of these, well, with most of the interventions, the more junior, slightly older, from an older generation, talking to those who are new to the profession and, have different ideas about information and communications technology, about culture and so on and so forth. So there was a real aspect that I didn't necessarily think we were going to find when we started out on this, but there's definitely, it's a non-trivial part of the findings, I think. So just to give you some of the idea of the things that struck me, I mean, one of the parts of the case studies, which I think comes out of each case study, is that individuals and at a firm level, an amount of self-reflection, a critical self-reflection. So the firm, at a firm level, saying we're just not doing well enough at this. We haven't got many black partners, or we've only got a very small proportion. This needs to change. So kind of not being afraid to make very clear where we're doing okay and we'd like to do better, but also pointing out where there is a genuine desire to do more and kind of holding hands up. I think that was really appreciated by those who were subject to the interventions and supported through the firms. And not just that, but also at an individual level, the kind of, Paulette was talking about having more honest conversations, more senior staff who were open and admitted, I feel uncomfortable, I'm not prepared, and I'm not, ready to have those conversations because I just feel clumsy. This is when a generational aspect really comes through as well. I mean, there's been a lot in the news about individuals using the wrong language, and that kind of uncomfortable and not feeling comfortable about it. That was something that if people admitted that, there was a real kind of acceptance and kind of people were thankful of that kind of honesty. Career support valued, especially when embedded in existing structures. I mean, ultimately, there was a real strength seen to giving those from less traditional disadvantaged backgrounds access to the kind of things that you would get if you were from more advantaged backgrounds and were better informed when you went into the profession about how the profession works, how to get ahead, how to present yourself, and so on and so forth. And I'll come back to this, but just making it clear that this is support that is tapping into what you should be tapping into, in terms of the support of line managers and so on and so forth. So, final slide, please. Cheers. So I've kind of talked about the confidence of senior colleagues in talking about ethnicity, but also this kind of generational insight, and social background is a particularly strong aspect, particularly of the widening participation interventions. Now, coming back to this idea of, trying to bring together some of the main findings and main insights from across the case studies. Ultimately, when you're talking about reverse mentoring and you're talking about the cost of people's time and so on, these things can't be done on the cheap. That there is, there's been a real backlash against, unconscious bias training, And for me, the reverse mentoring is a much more substantial, a much more resource intensive, potentially more impactful version of that. When you actually talk to somebody and get some idea of their experience, that for me is kind of got a better opportunity to have an impact. Also, it's not quick and easy. You know, there'll be uncomfortable conversations. And again, you know, the case studies hint at this kind of need to change and need to be disruptive to make those uncomfortable conversations less uncomfortable, to have them, and then to have that as a kind of standard that we talk about these issues. So just to kind of bring that together, one thing that struck in terms of the timelines is that, you know, there's a lot of support for new lawyers from BAME backgrounds, from disadvantaged backgrounds, to kind of know how things are done in the firm. So supporting new recruits so that they can get to the top, to help those, that kind of reverse mentoring, but also that culture change of helping the more senior members of firms to understand actually things do need to change, and we're teaching people how it is done at the moment, but ultimately there needs to be a bit of self-reflection and kind of understanding that that actually might not be the best way, and some things do need to change. The combination of these kind of two impacts eventually changes culture, but even as I'm talking about it, you know, there you go, that's a number of years. So we need to really kind of up things and have this happening across lots of firms. And we'll perhaps come back to the idea of, you know, long-term business case arguments. Business case arguments are apparent throughout the case studies. The idea that if you don't spread your net wide, you're going to lose out on talent, you know, losing out on individuals who leave your firm because they just can't see a way of progressing up the ladder. You know, these are kind of standard approaches, but getting better at these things does involve disruption, I think. So we'll kind of come back to that with the discussion at the end, hopefully.
Thank you very much for that, Peter, and for giving us a snapshot or an overview of the DLT 2020 case studies. But as you pointed out actually earlier on, the challenge really is to transform the increasing diversity at the junior levels to diversity at the top. And that's a real challenge, right? But it is, in essence, what's needed for gender and race. But actually, here we have 7 law firms who are actually trying to do just that. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on is organizational culture. I mean, that's at the heart of it all, really, isn't it? You know, and accountability for delivering change at all levels. I mean, that's got to be central to really driving change. So before we get into the nitty-gritty even more, we've brought together a panel of experts to discuss the need for interventionist and disruptive measures if we are to usher in meaningful and sustainable change for our profession. Panelists will share their experiences and insights on the factors needed for successful change on gender and/or race equity, diversity and inclusion. So our panelists are I, Stephanie Boyce, President of the Law Society of England and Wales, Peter Irwin, who we've heard from. He's a Professor of Applied Economics and Director of the Centre for Employment at the University of Westminster. Raphael Mokadis, who's the founder and managing director at RARE. Amma Akanzi, who is the UK Head of Diversity and Inclusion at BNP Paribas. Welcome to you all. If I can start with Stephanie, I would very much appreciate if you could provide a brief introduction and overview of the D&I landscape for the profession, particularly as it relates to gender and ethnicity.
Great. Thank you very much, Paulette. Might I say I'm delighted to be here to mark the launch of the 2020 Diversity League Table. So the Law Society has been gathering information on diversity in the profession by conducting research and engagement through our member divisions. We recently launched a report into the experience of Black, Asian, minority ethnic lawyers to shed a light on the challenges they are facing and what practical steps can be taken to build a more inclusive profession. And some of the key findings included just 8% of partners in the largest firms are Black, Asian or minority ethnic. And this has only changed or risen by 1% since 2014. Experiences vary between minority groups, although 17% of the profession identify as Black, Asian or minority ethnic. 10% of this number is made up of Asian solicitors, while only 3% of the profession identify as Black. There is a significant ethnicity pay gap. The average salary for white solicitors is £36.13 per hour, compared to £27.01 per hour for Black, Asian and minority ethnic solicitors. Our latest data also shows that over 50% of practicing solicitors in England and Wales are women, with female solicitors outnumbering their male colleagues. But yet there is still underrepresentation at senior levels, with only 31% of women in private practice are partners, compared to a vast number, 31% leaves the rest for men. So in addition, some of the challenges faced by women in law have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, such as caring and homeschooling responsibilities, often falling more heavily on women. So the Women in Leadership in Law programme and Women in Law pledge are two examples of high-profile initiatives to address gender inequality in the profession. The Law Society also recently produced a diversity profile of the solicitors' profession to examine the current state of diversity in the sector. And some of the ongoing outcomes evidenced underrepresentation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic lawyers and women at senior levels, with 35% of white private practice solicitor partners compared to 25% of ethnic minority solicitors. Difficulties assessing and progressing in the profession for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, with solicitors comparably more likely to have attended independent fee-paying schools than society in general, so 23% compared to 7%. And there is a concentration of women and Black, Asian and minority ethnic lawyers practicing in in-house or smaller firms, which suggests that there are ongoing barriers in larger firms for those from an ethnic minority background, who are more likely to be found in smaller firms than in larger firms. 36% of sole practitioners and 22% of partners in 2 to 4 partner firms are from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. And that compares to 6.5% of partners in the largest firms, with 81 partners or more. So it is clear that although progress has been made, there is still much more to be done.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a sort of state of the profession as it relates to D&I address. Thank you very much for that. Over to Raphael, and do excuse if I sometimes say Raph. I hope that's all right. I slip
that's
up.
Fine.
I would appreciate if you could provide a brief introduction and an overview of disruptive measures that measurably increase race equity, particularly by reference to RARE's race fairness commitment.
Sure. I'll be very brief because there are lots of interesting people, lots of interesting things to say, and this is literally all on the internet, racefairnesscommitment.com. You can see the thing that the group of us put together about a year ago, precisely because we felt, I think, as Paulette did, that there was an awful lot of talk. And I don't mean that, I'm not trying to diss anyone, like people felt bad, but they didn't know what to do, you know what I mean? Like it wasn't obvious what to do. And so we kind of put our heads together and said, what should you be doing if you really, really wanted to get on top of this? And actually, lots of firms were saying, oh, we should set targets. But the most important target is to treat people fairly, right? No one wants to get a job because you won the quota. No one wants that. What we want is not to be discriminated against. What we want is a fair shot. And that's what the race fairness commitment is built on. It's built on the idea of fairness or proportionality, i.e., I've got 10,000 black kids with great grades and 10,000 white kids with great grades, all applying. The same proportion of them should get an interview. Not within 20%, because some foxy sociologist in America 40 years ago made up an 80, whatever it's called, the 20-80 whatever rule. No, the same proportion. Same proportion should get an offer. If they train with you, same proportion should be retained on qualification. Same proportion should decide they've had enough after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It happens, that's okay. But when all the black ones are leaving and all the white ones are staying, or when all the black ones are leaving and only half the white ones are leaving, there's something funny going on. And what we're saying is, with this data, you can work out when and where the something funny is. And then you go in hard. You look at exit interviews because you've got proper data. You look at focus groups because you've got proper data. You look at your reverse mentoring because you're talking to people. And then there is this very elegant phrase Peter used, how things should be done and how things should no longer be done. That's the point, isn't it? You get all this data, and then you've got to use a vulgar, colloquial, possibly sexist expression, you've got to grow a pair. Because you've got to go in and sort it out. And there are a couple of examples that we haven't published, but we have heard of leaders saying, this is unacceptable, you're gone. Or this is unacceptable, I'm telling the whole room, if you do anything like this again, you're gone. And that works really, really well. It works really, really well because it changes the way people behave. I know all the arguments against it. I know partnerships are different from corporations. I know that there isn't one single boss. I know that some of these people make their firms an awful lot of money. I get all that, but I also know that clear statements have an impact. And so the value of the race fairness commitment and its disruption is actually to create that discomfort that's been mentioned, and to use hard metrics with which no one could reasonably argue to focus attention on the areas that require it. Now, I don't know what kind of impact it's having because it's too soon. It's the nature of these things. What I do know is that 40 plus firms have been engaged and collaborative and getting all these people, all these business services people whose job it is to count sheep or count cats or nail jelly to a wall or whatever the analogy you're going to use is, getting them all to agree on similar terminologies so that we can have measurements that are meaningful, because you're putting 40 firms' data together and you're going to get a profession-wide overview. That has been really hard, and I've been dead impressed by the way people have stuck at it. And it occurs to me that maybe this time is different. Like, I remember Rodney King, I remember Stephen Lawrence, and when this happened, I was like, here we go again. But it does feel different. And that's why we did this thing. And that's why when these leaders were going, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? We were like, you sign up to this, because this lot have signed and you should sign too. And then eventually they all signed. And I'm hoping that this is part of a change, a movement that is significant. I can't hand on heart say it is for certain, but it's not yet clear that it isn't. And that's, I think, progress considering the history that we've all got.
Thanks very much, Raf. It just really underscores the importance of having a sort of data and metrics-driven approach to dealing with this issue, and accountability. We'll probably say accountability a lot during this discussion, but we can't underestimate how important that is at each point in that journey towards change. If I can turn to Anna for your introduction and an overview of some of the D&I challenges in industry, particularly among in-house legal and business teams, and what actions on race and ethnicity have, in your opinion, yielded positive results?
Thank you, Paula. I'm very pleased to be here. I think I'm going to add a bit of a personal story to this. I am a capital markets lawyer, and I started in a Magic Circle law firm. And at the time, in my intake, I was the only Black female. So I was the only person that had that intersection of gender and race. And so I felt that experience very personally. And as I developed and progressed through the firm, things didn't really change. I moved into an in-house role, and I think a lot of people from BAME backgrounds tend to move from law firms to in-house roles because they feel that they're not being supported, and they feel that there's just more opportunities in an in-house role. Unfortunately, what happens in in-house roles is that they tend to recruit from magic circle law firms. So the struggles that you have in a law firm are directly translated into an in-house role, because you're still surrounded with colleagues who have left magic law firms, circle law firms, and moved into in-house roles. So the challenges have been discussed in terms of women, and I think predominantly in terms of black and brown people, in the sense of progression, and in terms of being retained, and in terms of promotion. And what I'm seeing in the in-house role is that you have to address the tone from the top. Leadership has to be behind any initiatives to drive change. It's no good sort of parking it in the HR department and letting them sort of figure things out. You need the change to be transformative, not transactional. Another thing which you also touched upon is the culture. It's really important that you address your culture, because you can have as many initiatives as you want to bring people into an organization, but if the culture is not receptive, if it's toxic, they're not going to stay. So you can't do one without the other, and you have to focus on that. How do you address culture? I think it's definitely about education, and you need to share the lived experiences of people who are from minority groups, so that leaders, line managers, understand that the challenges that they face are very different to the majority. And I'm not discussing giving them preferential treatment. I'm just discussing the fact that they need to acknowledge that the experiences and the obstacles that they have to overcome to get there are very, very different. Other ideas have already been shared. I think mentoring is a great thing. Reverse mentoring with strict guidelines so that people understand the expectations, because to state the obvious, you don't want the onus to be on the junior person to sort of do all the education. For example, the situation today, it's traumatic. We're marking the anniversary of something that really affected all of us. And you've got to remember that colleagues who are in that situation will probably be in traumatized states. So with reverse mentoring, you do need to consider that. And also in terms of educating line managers, so that they think about who they're giving stretch assignments to, who they are putting on talent programs or accelerator programs, who they are putting in terms of client-facing work. And I think this sort of touches on the unconscious bias piece, but we address this as inclusive leadership. So you really need to ensure that the people that make the decisions, whether it be in terms of allocating work, whether it be in terms of recruitment, whether it be in terms of putting people in positions so that they can garner experience and progress, understand where their biases may be, and how to address and change those. And also you have to look at the systems as well. And I think this is where Raphael's point about looking at your data, because some things are very obvious, but if you have the data and say, well, actually, in terms of senior associates or senior leaders, the percentage is X amount and the BAME population is X amount, there's a discussion there and nobody's going to challenge you. And I think the last thing that I would say is that in terms of recruitment, look in different spaces. What tends to happen is that people are recruiting from the same universities, which are generally not very diverse, not full of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And people just need to look at different routes. Is it apprenticeships? Is it sponsoring people from who are at school? People just need to think outside the box and be creative, because the talent is there, and the constant story that it's not there doesn't wash and shouldn't continue to exist.
Thank you very much, Emma. Really struck a chord there, and it goes back to that whole sort of point of organisational culture, and the fact that it's really important to have measures in place such that evaluations, promotion, pay, sponsorship, stretch assignments, and so on are actually completely transparent. That process is transparent, and that it's fair and it's free from bias. And that really is an important check and balance to ensure that these programs, these ideas, these initiatives actually have legs and are sustainable. So thank you very much for that. And now back to Peter. What for you is the most significant learning from DLT 2020, from the case studies? And what are the key factors or interventions that work or that are successful?
So again, I mean, there's a lot of detail that I can't cover. Just picking up on what Raphael said, I absolutely agree entirely. Constantly go on about looking at what did your applicant pool look like? What did your shortlisted pool look like? Who did you interview? Who got the job? Who accepted the job? If you look at that pipeline, you can spot where you've got a problem immediately. And it's such a straightforward thing to do. The depressing thing is you go into firms and they say, oh, that data, oh, really? It's like, you must collect it. You have to collect it. It has to be somewhere. So, you know, these things. And to say, you know, for Amma, that the reverse mentoring scheme, yeah, one of the things that I was very impressed with, and we spent a lot of time talking, is exactly how that is done. You know, what are the kind of the direction to both, you know, and actually both kind of sides of at least the people we interviewed, were very positive about the direction that had been given to them and the kind of context in which it had been carried out. But I agree entirely, it needs to be handled very carefully. And in these kind of talking about these examples, the thing that comes out for me from the case studies is the need to disrupt. So for many years, I mean, if you look outside of the D&I area in terms of academia and practice, there's lots of things in terms of workplaces where we have good practice. So you'd have workplace voice. We could think of affinity groups as being a form of workplace voice. You know, the idea of inclusion and belonging cuts across, you know, a variety of diversity strands. You know, it's about everybody bringing themselves to the gun. And these are good practice, but, you know, increasingly, are they actually going, then they're necessary. Everybody should, you know, have these things in place for good workplaces, but I don't think they're going to make the change in terms of really disrupting things. They're kind of good workplace practice, full stop. They're not going to get black lawyers from disadvantaged backgrounds to partner level. You know, I think the disruption and kind of, if you read the thought piece and the case study interventions, there's some examples of that. And in particular, I was particularly impressed with, and it's not in the case studies, but it came out of the discussions. We were looking at BCLP's innovative program of disrupting usual practice. So, you know, you've got the classic thing where partners select teams for particular contracts. And what they did was they brought in an independent resource manager that sits between the partners and the teams, and they make the choice. They get the spec from the partner, and then they choose the team. Now, the partner might not be entirely happy because they haven't got their way, but the idea is to disrupt one of those ways that, you know, fairness, the fairness that Raphael's talking about is not actually seen and is not demonstrated. So you break those chains. So have a look at the data. Good firms are looking at their data, finding out where they've got a problem. They're sticking their hand up and saying, right, you know, we have a problem here. We're going to do something about it. That's really appreciated. But then actually going in and being willing to annoy some senior people with saying, this is going to be done. You may not like it, but this is how we're going to tackle this problem.
Thank you very much, Fisa. That's a classic equality or access to equal opportunity to progress. And I think Amma also mentioned, we were chatting previously of a similar observation around work allocation as a means of, or independent work allocation as a means of sort of disrupting that cycle. No, so that's great. I'd like to come back to Raf, if I may. So one of the things that is covered in the case studies is an interview with the SRA's senior MD. She's did a piece. We actually did a piece on the regulatory requirement of the SRA for firms to track and record their workforce diversity data. And the aggregated data is published biannually. And you know, I for one recognize that, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage or improve it. And I note that RARE's race fairness commitment focuses on data. Raf, can you tell us why does data matter so much? Why is it so important?
There's a culture war going on. It's horrible. One lot, we put a capital letter when we say black, we put him, her after our name, we throw statues into the sea. The other lot think the British Empire was marvellous, colonialism was quote unquote actual verbatim recording of what someone said to a colleague of mine, good for Africa, and we all need to be a bit prouder and stop pussyfooting around sensibilities, right? And what's the way to triangulate this? The way to triangulate this is to present incontrovertible facts. Let me give you a really, really hard example. Peter said, yes, you should be tracking all this stuff. We go in, we tell these firms, and then they go, oh, that data, oh, and then they hide behind the fact that they don't have the system. And then they keep saying, oh, I'm all for diversity, but not if it drives down standards, because, you know, these black and brown chappies whispering, they're not that smart. And it's all lies, right? But you're just going to keep on going ding dong, back and forth until you've got hard metrics that end the conversation about whether what you're saying is true. That's how you move the conversation on to what you're going to do about it. And so we've actually gone and we've built an applicant tracking system, which is a piece of software that manages the applications for firms. And in this applicant tracking system is live adverse impact tracking. So you can see straight away whether you've got a statistically significant impact on people from lower socioeconomic groups or particular racial groups, with blacks split out from other ethnic minorities, because we know that anti-black racism is more noxious and more prevalent. And then we go even further, we adjust the grades, because the argument might be, oh, well, you know, there's so much disadvantage black people, very sadly and unfortunately, it's not their fault, poor dears, but, you know, unfortunately, they tend to cluster, you know, their A-level grades aren't that great. Okay, fine, whatever. I'm not going to have the argument about how important A-level grades are. I'm going to meet you where you are, and I'm going to adjust the grades. And you know what happens when we do that? Quite often, there's still an adverse impact against black people. So all this stuff about, oh, they're not out there, the pool isn't there, forget that. When you compare black kids with 3As versus white kids with 3As, black kids are still less likely. And when you show people that metric, then they really, and then they say, I wonder why that might be. What is it in our process? And then you can have a look at the process, and maybe the process values particular sorts of work experience, which you tend to get due to parental connections, which black people are less likely to have. Maybe the process values particular forms of extracurricular activities that might be linked to certain sorts of cultural capital. But having that data enables a conversation that goes beyond he said, she said. And actually, I've seen people move. I've seen people's minds shift. The type of people that you wouldn't have thought would have been allies, naturally, of the sort of thing that we're doing. And that, I think, is a value of it. That's number one. Number two is a very obvious point. If you have good metrics, you can track improvement. And when you can track improvement, you can celebrate improvement. So I've become a bit of a bore on this topic over the last 15, 16 years, because I'm sick of fighting the same battles over and over again. I want to fight new and more difficult battles, and the data enables us to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raf. That's quite sobering. It's so necessary, though. I'd like to come back to Amma. In terms of maintaining the momentum towards change, I recall last autumn, JP Morgan and others in the financial services industry penned an open letter to the global legal community on committing on racial diversity and equality. How pivotal, in your view, is the client's voice in advancing the argument for change on racial diversity among law firm teams who advise you?
Thank you. Actually, BSN was signatory to that letter as well, and I sort of worked with our GC to understand why that was necessary. As we know, the client is king, right? This is what it's all about. We have to please the client. So I think the client has the power to disrupt the system. And what do I mean by that? Usually when law firms pitch for jobs, they tend to bring the teams in. And as a client, you can say, I want a diverse team. And you get the response, well, actually, this is the best team, suggesting that the fact that all the team is white and male, or white and a mixture of men and female, is best. And there's this undertone that if you diversify the team, i.e. being putting black or brown people, you're lowering the quality. So first of all, you have to challenge that. And secondly, you also have to say, I want a diverse team to pitch, but I also want a diverse team to work on the transaction. So don't just drag the lone voice in that department who happens to be black or brown for the pitch, and then source that transaction or that query in another way. So clients can insist on that. Another thing that I think that law firms forget is that clients appreciate partners who understand the cultures in which the organizations are operating in. And what do I mean by that? I'm an emerging markets lawyer, and I did a lot of capital market transactions around the world. And I really appreciated, and I lent more on law firms that had partners who understood the continent. And what I mean by the continent is Africa. They understood the culture, they understood the way business was done. And also they have all the connections with the local law firms, and they also have connections with the organizations as well. And this is something that I think law firms often forget, is that the associates that they have who are from diverse backgrounds, don't underestimate their connections and who they know and their ability to bring in work. Yeah. And I also think as a client, you also have to look at who's been seconded to you. And this is something, a conversation I'm having with my legal department at the moment, and saying, you know, don't just call your friend and say, you know, bring your favored candidate. Show me a selection and at least interview that selection so that you are bringing diverse people into the team and choosing from a different selection of people. I also think that what law firms also need to think about when they are working with their clients is that we, the client, should approach people that we know that have worked for us in the past. So what do I mean by that? If I come across associates, particularly women or BAME associates who have done well on transactions or who I've met socially, I'm quite happy to contact them and say, look, I've got a situation. It's probably not in your area, but I'm coming to you so you can refer me. Because there are brownie points for that, right? People, if that person is referring, people in the firm will acknowledge that. And also, I think the whole point about giving people from black and brown backgrounds exposure is making sure that they are seen within the firm to have the external connections. They're seen within the firm to be the ones that the clients like. And that's how you sort of change the dial. And that's how you increase the representation and the progression and succession of people from BAME backgrounds.
Thank you very much, Anna. I've made a key note of the headline points that clients have the power to disrupt the system. And of course, we thank you for doing just that. I'm just conscious of the time, we're moving towards 7 o'clock, and I would like to hear from Stephanie. So the DLT 2020 case studies show that firms have a more cohesive approach to promoting D&I, with case study interventions embedded within the sort of wider strategic programs of the firm. And as highlighted in the publication, whilst these developmental programs raise aspiration and widen participation of diverse talent, or for diverse talent, which is key to future progress, many firms recognize the need to go further and ensure that raised expectations are met. So my question is, what do you consider to be the critical next steps for law firms on the road to greater representation for gender and ethnic minority lawyers, particularly at senior levels?
So quite right, there's been a lot of focus on the numbers in recent years in terms of representation at different levels. But as our Race for Inclusion research found, we need to look more at how people feel and their experiences within the profession. And this can be done within organisations, firms, by holding focus groups, listening sessions, and responding to issues arising in them, making changes and seeking further feedback. So in the focus groups we held last year as part of our research, ethnic minority solicitors frequently shared experiences of being made to feel like they didn't belong because of banter or microaggressions relating to their ethnicity, hair, or religion. We also found that ethnic minority solicitors were more likely to say that they had been bullied and that they had lower levels of reported well-being than their white peers in surveys. So regular staff surveys or cultural assessments that break down the findings by ethnicity can also be helpful as a way of identifying issues and monitoring progress. But looking at and monitoring how work is allocated, we spoke about that earlier, by ethnicity can also be a valuable indicator of how inclusive an organisation is. People tend, especially when pressured, to assign and go to those who they feel most comfortable with, rather than consciously making the effort to allocate work opportunities in an equitable way. But ultimately, we know that we've achieved cultural change if we see the retention and progression gaps close, and we have more equal representation across the profession, including at senior levels. So take time to understand what the particular problem is in the organisation, the firm, and so forth. Analyse the data, look at what the evidence shows and what other organisations, firms, businesses have done successfully to create change. Basically, act strategically as you would with any other business challenges, plan, deliver, evaluate impact, learn and adapt your approach to improve outcomes. We need to move beyond the tick box, because we hear the tick box approach, we hear so much about that. And this means ensuring at senior level that we have that buy-in, that accountability, and also transparency around data and setting targets. And we heard from Raphael in respect of targets. But like key performance indicators, it can help create the focus and sustained action needed across the business to drive change. And finally, don't assume that D&I is something just for minority employees or partners to work or lead on. It is something that everyone needs to take responsibility for. It's important to engage and listen to minority employees and partners and to give them visibility, but do not rely on their voluntary, unpaid efforts to execute your strategy. So it's good that some businesses, organisations, firms have begun to recognise that when people are contributing to D&I, they should be given billable credits for their time. This is a good idea, as dedicating time to work on D&I, which benefits the business, may hinder an individual's progression opportunities if it takes them away from billable hours work. So there's a whole measure and raft of ideas there.
No, thank you very much for that, Stephanie. A lot to take away there. I did have a final quickfire question for the panelists, which I will hold back on because we do have some questions from the audience. I think that perhaps we only have time to take one. And this question is perhaps for Peter and maybe Stephanie. It's from Mrs. Golding. Right, Stephanie and Peter, is the term BAME still valid? If so, have participants accepted this term? And if not, where do you think we need to go in regards to referring to the acronym BAME? Thank you.
Oh, if I may, Peter.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say, when I have spoken tonight, I have not used the acronym. I don't find the acronym helpful. So what I have committed to doing last year, very early on, committed to doing is not using the acronym, but spelling out the word where appropriate, where necessary, spelling it out in full. We know that there are inequalities and inaccuracies within the acronym itself. It doesn't reflect the true picture. And if you break down, if you break down some of the statistics even further, actually, if you come from a Black Caribbean background, you are less well represented in the legal profession, the solicitor profession, than if you come from a Black African background or indeed an Asian background. And similarly, if you break down an Asian background by South Asian, East Asian, and so forth. So one of the things that I have done as president of the Law Society of England and Wales is I do not use the acronym where appropriate, where necessary, because I don't find it helpful.
That is helpful. Thank you very much, Stephanie. So we are now at 6:58, and as much as I would love us to continue our debate and discussion, we will need to draw things to a close. Thank you for that question, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to take any further questions from the audience. So I would conclude by saying that it's been an absolute pleasure being part of this important debate, and I do hope that our attendees have found the discussions and insights useful and empowering as we all strive towards a more equal and fair profession. As we depart, let's really challenge our organisations on their commitment to gender and racial diversity and the steps that they're taking to achieve and promote fairness. It really is also important for each of us to play a part and be part of that change that we want to see in our working environments and obviously in our profession as a whole. So huge thanks to our panelists for your expertise and insightful contribution to this debate, and of course the amazing work that you're all doing to move the dial on race, fairness and equity. Thank you, Stephanie, Raphael, Amma and Peter. Thank you also to the Law Society for sponsoring DLT 2020. Thank you to the 7 leading law firms who have shared their D&I interventions, and also to the Solicitors Regulation Authority for their ongoing support of the work that we're doing in this space. You will all have received a digital copy of DLT 2020, and of course for this publication we really want to drive the development of evidence-based D&I practice and initiatives right across the legal sector, which we believe is essential to shift the dial. We do hope you enjoy reading it. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a good evening.